Major General Andrew Jackson advanced from Fort Williams on the Coosa River on the morning of March 24, 1814. His objective was the fortified Horseshoe Bend of the Tallapoosa River. It was the frontier general's second attempt to capture Tallapoosa, as the Creeks called their fortified town. His first raid, 3 months earlier, ended in tactical victory, but strategic defeat at the Battle of Muscogee, and a near disaster in the second engagement as he was withdrawing back to the Coosa River. Reinforced, he was now determined to try again. The Red Sticks, meanwhile, were desperate for resupply. Despite their relative success, heavy fighting against 3 U.S. armies had depleted their stocks of arms and ammunition. Many warriors prepared for the coming battle armed with only war clubs or bows and arrows. The battles had also reduced the strength of the Creek fighting forces. Anticipated reinforcements from Lower Creek and Seminole Country were defeated and driven back at the Battle of Muscogee Creek. The Creeks also did not know where Jackson planned to strike. The prophet Josiah Francis and Peter McQueen, a prominent war chief, were fortifying the Hickory Ground near the confluence of the Tallapoosa and Coosa rivers. This was the heart of the Creek Nation, and it could not be given up without a fight. This need to defend multiple fronts meant that Menoa would enter the battle against Jackson heavily outnumbered. Jackson's army pushed through the wilderness for 2 days. His route left open the possibility of a strike against the Hickory Ground for almost the entire distance of his march, keeping McQueen and Francis pinned down at the Hickory Ground, and Menoa behind his fortifications at Horseshoe Bend, although scouts from each place observed the U.S. Army's movements. It was not until the Army reached Muscogee battleground on the evening of March 26th that Jackson's objective became clear. As the exhausted soldiers stretched out to sleep along the heights of Muscogee Creek, they could hear the drums and shouts from the Red Stick camps. The chiefs and prophets were preparing their warriors for battle. As his weary troops slept, Jackson ordered Brigadier General Coffee to take a force of 1,300 mounted Tennesseans, 500 allied Cherokees, and 100 Big Warrior Faction Creek warriors and cross the Tallapoosa River downstream from the bend. Coffee marched from camp at 6:30 a.m. on the 27th, crossing the river at Little Island Ford, 3 miles downstream from Tallapoosa. He sent some of the allied Cherokee and Creek warriors forward as sharpshooters to fire from concealed positions along the riverbank opposite the village, should any of Menoa's warriors try to cross. General Coffee's greatest concern was that his troops might face a rear attack by warriors from Okefuskie, another Red Stick town 5 miles, a little over 8 kilometers, downstream from his crossing place. To protect against this, he maintained a strong rear guard and moved away from the river to approach the battlefield. This allowed his mounted men to advance along more open ground, where they could easily operate against an approaching enemy force. The thick woods and hills along the river also provided excellent cover. Coffee was still 1/2 mile, about 0.8 kilometers from Tallapoosa, when a loud Red Stick war cry echoed through the cliffs and hills along the Tallapoosa. Anticipating an immediate attack, he formed his men into a line of battle on open ground back from the river, ready to face a rear attack at any minute, but continuing to move forward. When Coffee was 1/4 mile, 0.4 kilometers from his ordered position, he heard the opening salvos of Jackson's artillery. The remaining Cherokee and Creek warriors in his command rushed forward to the outer banks of the Horseshoe Bend. As General Coffee's command moved cautiously into position on the far side of the Horseshoe Bend, Jackson and his officers prepared to attack the primary Red Stick defenses. After allowing Coffee several hours to complete his movement, Jackson began his advance on the Red Stick fortification. From the heights of what is now called Cotton Hill, he took his first look at the horseshoe-shaped peninsula and the challenge that awaited his army.
Across the neck of land which leads into it from the north, they had erected a breastwork of greatest compactness and strength, from 5 to 8 feet high, and prepared with double rows of portholes very artfully arranged. The figure of this wall manifested no less skill in the projectors of it than its construction, An army could not approach it without being exposed to a double and crossfire from the enemy, who lay in perfect security behind it. Major General Andrew Jackson, March 31st, 1814.
Archaeological investigations suggest that the fortification was a zigzag-covered way with both front and rear-facing defensive walls, and a log-covered floor to prevent muddiness in case of rain. The faces of the walls inclined outward slightly, making them difficult to scale, and sharpened stakes provided additional protection. Hoping to breach this formidable structure, Jackson ordered his artillery forward to a hill about 73 meters from the center of the creek fortification.
At 10:30 a.m., I had planted my artillery on a small eminence, distant from its nearest point about 80 yards, and from its farthest about 250, from whence I immediately opened a brisk fire upon its center. With the musketry and rifles, I kept up a galling fire whenever the enemy showed themselves behind their works or ventured to approach them. This was continued with occasional intermissions for about 2 hours. Major General Andrew Jackson, March 31st, 1814.
As Jackson's force was battling for control of the barricade, Coffee's command opened fire on the Tallapoosa village, where a mass of women and children could be seen running from cabin to cabin. Using this musket and rifle fire for cover, 3 Cherokee warriors swam the 120-yard-wide river and brought back a number of red stick dugout canoes. Others followed, and soon a small fleet of dugouts was available.
In which crafts a number of them embarked and landed in the bend with the enemy. Colonel Gideon Morgan, who commanded the Cherokees, Captain Kerr, and Captain William Russell, with a part of his company of spies, was amongst the first that crossed the river. They advanced into the village and very soon drove the enemy from the huts up the riverbank to the fortified works, from which they were fighting you. They pursued and continued to annoy them during the whole action. Brigadier General John Coffee, April 1st, 1814.
From his command post on the hills, Jackson could see 150 Cherokees, Allied Creeks, and Tennesseans from Russell and Bean's companies of Coffee's command fight their way from the burning village north to the rear face of the barricade. He now made the critical decision of the battle.
Finding that this force, notwithstanding the bravery they displayed, was wholly insufficient to dislodge them, and that General Coffee had entirely secured the opposite bank of the river, I now determined to take their works by storm. The men by whom this was to be effected had been waiting with impatience to receive the order and hailed it with acclamation. Major General Andrew Jackson, March 28, 1814.
The regulars of the 39th Infantry stormed the Red Stick fortification near its center. Major Lemuel P. Montgomery, for whom the city of Montgomery, Alabama is named, was killed just as he topped the wall. Ensign Sam Houston, the future president of the Republic of Texas, was shot in the thigh by an arrow, but continued to fight despite his wound. Tennessee militia regiments struck the wall alongside the 39th. The outnumbered Red Stick warriors fought with incredible desperation.
Having maintained for a few minutes a very obstinate contest, muzzle to muzzle, through the portholes, in which many of the enemy's balls were welded to the bayonets of our muskets, our troops succeeded in gaining possession of the opposite side of the works. The event could no longer be doubtful. The enemy, although many of them fought to the last with that kind of bravery desperation inspires, were at length entirely routed and cut to pieces. The entire margin of the river which surrounded the peninsula was strewed with the slain. Major General Andrew Jackson, April 1st, 1814.
As the U.S. regulars and Tennessee militia finally broke through at the barricade and swept across into the Horseshoe Bend, a remaining corps of Red Stick warriors fell back into a prepared position on a nearby hill. They had fortified the slopes of this spot with brush and carefully arranged fallen trees to create a web of positions that the soldiers were forced to drive them from one at a time. In Jackson's words, quote, "The firing and slaughter continued until it was suspended by the darkness of night." End quote. Even as bloody fighting continued on the last stand hill, some Red Sticks, most of them badly wounded, tried to escape to the river. Coffee's Tennesseans were waiting there for them.
I ordered about 1/3 of the men to be posted around the bend on the riverbank, whilst the balance remained in line to protect our rear. Captain Hammond's company of Rangers took post on the riverbank on my right, and during the whole engagement kept up a continued and destructive fire on those of the enemy that attempted to escape into the river, and killed a very large proportion of those that were found dead under the bank, as well as many others sunk under the water. From the report of my officers, as well as from my own observation, I feel warranted in saying that from 250 to 300 of the enemy was buried underwater and was not numbered with the dead that was found. Brigadier General John Coffee, April 1st, 1814.
Coffee also recalled Lieutenant Bean from the peninsula and stationed his company on an island at the lower end of the battlefield. He reported killing many Creek warriors in the water and executing a handful that managed to reach shore. No prisoners were taken. As the sun rose over Horseshoe Bend the next morning, a handful of Creek warriors continued to fight. Jackson reported that his men fought and killed 16 more Red Sticks. They also counted the dead. The bodies of 557 of Menawa's warriors were found on the ground. Both Jackson and Coffee estimated that the actual number of Red Sticks killed was much higher, reporting that hundreds more were carried away by the Tallapoosa River. The soldiers captured around 250 prisoners, all but 2 or 3 of them women and children. U.S. losses in the battle were 70 killed and 206 wounded. Medical care was primitive in 1814, and a number of the wounded died in the days and weeks that followed. Creek sources indicate that around 70 surviving warriors managed to escape at the end of the battle. Among them was Menawa himself. Wounded 7 times, he collapsed, but came to during the night to find himself in a pile of dead bodies. He silently slipped into a dugout canoe on the riverbank and floated away from the scene, living to remain an important leader in the Muscogee Creek Nation for many years to come. Another survivor, Tallapoosa, was wounded 11 times, but was rescued by his brother, Imatha Hutke, who carried him into a swamp where they remained hidden until the soldiers withdrew. Tallapoosa carried the bullets from Horseshoe Bend in his body for the rest of his life. His grandson, George Washington Grayson, later became a prominent chief, as well as an important Native American businessman and newspaper publisher. He fought for the establishment of a Native American state instead of today's Oklahoma. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend broke the power of the Creek Nation east of the Mississippi. Recognizing that they could not hope to defeat Jackson, the Prophet Francis, Peter McQueen, and other important Red Stick leaders retreated to Spanish Florida with their followers. Jackson soon led his soldiers into Hickory Ground itself, building Fort Jackson near the confluence of the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers. 5 months after his victory, he forced Muscogee leaders, all but possibly one of whom had sided with the United States in the war, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The treaty ceded 22 million acres of Creek lands, including all holdings in West and South Alabama, as well as South Georgia, to the United States as reparations for the cost of the war. 22 years later, the United States forced the once powerful Creek people to relocate west to what is now Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. At Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in Daviston, Alabama, I'm Rachel Cox for 2IT TV.